Welcome to New England Authors. We explore stories of New England and the rich cultural heritage that we have. Our guest today is Gabriel Valjan. Yes. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You've written so many books, very good books. You're an excellent writer and stories. And you have a book called a series. You have two series of books. One is called the Roma series, which takes place a bit in Italy and a bit in New England.
That's correct.
Why don't we start off with the first one? It was called Roma Underground. Tell us a little about it. You had a main character. What was her name? Bianca?
So my main character is Bianca, and in Roma Underground, we see her take off to Rome. She's left the United States. She is by profession a forensic accountant. She started with I fictionalized a government agency called Rendition.
Right.
And she originally started as a young woman. She was recruited, and she has a particularly very good skills at detecting patterns. And she was hired at a time when we did not have laws on the books for white-collar crimes.
Yes.
So they were trying to figure out ways of capturing people and then figuring out how to prosecute them.
Yes, I had a guest before who talked about white-collar crimes.
Yes.
And it wasn't even considered a crime until about 1939, and they didn't start prosecuting people until the 1960s.
That's correct. I think your guest's name was Eugene Solstice.
Yes, that's right.
And he did bring up the point that up to the mid-30s, late 30s, the concept was very hard to introduce because, in essence, the concept of crime was something where there was a victim, often violence.
Right.
And with white-collar crime, it's in many, even up to late 80s in the savings and loan scandal, it was considered a victimless crime.
Yeah.
So if you invested money, it was considered, well, you understood there was going to be risk.
Uh-huh.
So my character, Bianca, starts with this agency. She's paid very well. She enjoys her work. But she starts seeing that Rendition, her employer, is now morphing into this kind of nefarious organization where they're not only going after people that they consider perpetrators of financial crimes, but they're actually eliminating people. They're also starting to target people that they feel are a threat to America's financial dominance, both international and domestic. So,
and Rendition appears in all your books, doesn't it?
It does. Well, in the Roma series.
In the Roma
not in the
series,
second
yeah,
series.
yeah.
So if you look at the covers, I have a red R. That's the symbol for Rendition.
Uh-huh.
So she takes off to Rome in the first book. She actually is financially set off. She's done well. She had a prior love interest that, gave her money and stuff. So she's pretty much free.
Yeah.
And she's living her life. She's very low profile. And then, she meets a man there, and there's sort of a love interest there. Now, he works for the Italian version of the financial ministry, which investigates financial crimes, improprieties.
Right.
Things
Is that Dante?
That's Dante.
Right.
And he has a circle of friends that he works with in an office. And essentially, in the first novel, the premise is through him, she becomes attracted. She always likes a challenge. Somebody is stealing things from the Roman underground, which in Italy today, in some of the major cities, they have these amateur archaeologists that will go underground and they will try to map out the ancient city. If they actually find any relics, they report them. They're cataloged, and they're often put in museums or they're given to academics. But somebody's stealing them and putting them out on the market.
Yeah.
Part of that is actually based on real events that happened in the late 80s.
Yes.
So I have 5 books in the Roma series. And you meet members of the team. And one of the things I wanted to do to convey to people the history and the culture, and especially the cultural diversity of Italy, was that each one of my characters comes from a different part of Italy. So there are some, I won't say antagonisms, but there are conflicts which I think reflect some of the cultural diversity that is in Italy, the North and the South. I did that primarily because I found that most Americans, when they think of Italy, their perception is, unfortunately, things like The Sopranos or The Godfather. A lot of the culture is from southern Italy.
A lot of the culture in America.
In America,
yeah.
And there's reasons for that. Most of the immigration that came from Italy came from the southern half.
Right.
Agricultural went bad. People were exploited. So most of the Italian immigration that came to this country was 1880 to 1920. That's significant because what people interpret for Italian culture and language is based on immigrants. And if you actually look at it, the Italian language that we have from immigrants here is often the descendant of village dialect from the late 19th century.
Yes, that's right.
So a good example is there's a famous scene in The Godfather where Michael Corleone is in a restaurant.
Yeah.
And he confronts Salazzo the Turk. And he's with Sterling Hayden, who's a corrupt cop. And what happens there is Salazzo says for a minute, I'm going to speak to Michael in Italian. And they give you subtitles in the movie. I have a very good friend that's from northern Italy, and I know a little bit of Italian. And I asked him to watch the scene, and he said, it's complete gibberish.
Yes.
It's unintelligible. Now, maybe somebody from that village, although Salazzo's a Turk, but somebody from that village might get pieces of those words. But to a contemporary Italian, none of that makes any sense. And that's because Italian in this country, in many cases, became frozen in time.
Yes.
So I have a character that's from Naples, who's the senior partner or the senior investigator in the series. He's from Naples, and his culture comes up in the fourth book, which is Turning to Stone, where they confront the Camorra.
The Camorra, which is the mafia of the Naples area, right? That's the name of the...
And in that particular story, we're seeing, or I tried to convey a change in the mafia, where the Camorra, as you said, is indigenous to Naples. There's a great book out that came out a couple of years ago by Roberto Saviano called Camorra. There's a film by it, but the film is not related to the book. But in that particular installment of the Roma series, I tried to show the Camorra and a new wave of the Sicilian mafia, which is becoming more corporatized, and that's actually been happening in this country. A lot of the mafia went into legitimate businesses. In fact, if you look at law enforcement today, the biggest area in the world where they're having problems with corporatized mafia is London.
Interesting.
A lot of these mafia dons basically send their sons or their grandsons to London School of Economics.
Right, exactly.
And they're learning what ways to go around. Your guest, when he was talking about white-collar crime, talked about how sometimes people in companies don't know necessarily that they're committing crime, or they're doing a very selective interpretation of things, but they think they're doing it the best for their company. So the mafia became the same way. They're doing it best for their family.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of interesting points. Excuse me for interrupting, but you bring up the idea of things being stolen from Italy, and that was happening all the time. That was paintings were stolen from churches and so on, and in Italy there are many regional dialects, and people at home speak the regional dialect. And the southern dialects are unintelligible to the northerners, right?
It can be. I think, the way I understand it today is a lot of people speak, and this isn't just with Italians. I think you see this with Jewish people, that they do Yiddish at home. People speak their own when they're home with their family, the family traditions. But when you go out in business or out in public or you're in the academic setting as a student or a teacher, you're speaking standard Italian.
Yeah, when the head of the mafia Riena was arrested.
Toto Riena,
yeah, he came to the magistrate, in front of the magistrate, and apologized that he only spoke the local dialect. He didn't speak proper Italian. I think he was illiterate, illiterate as well.
A lot of them. What I tried to do is, try to show a different side to Italian culture, that it's not all mafia. And, in the first book, you have the archaeological thefts. That actually has happened several times in Italy's history. The most infamous case is the Elgin marbles with the British in Greece. So there's a lot of politics involved in that, a cultural appropriation, who can take better care of the archaeological finds.
Yeah.
In the second book, which I bring to Italy, I have Bianca now realizing that she has feelings for Dante, but doesn't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And she's a tough, independent woman, but not, I would say, somebody without feeling. So
no, she's a very forthright woman.
She's forthright, and she's no shrinking violet.
Yeah.
So in the second book, which is set here in Boston, she is investigating somebody who is trying to take the pharmaceutical industry to the next level, but he's also upsetting a lot of people. He's upsetting the status quo. His focus is he's studying wasps. And
yes, well, the insect. Yeah. Excuse me one second. I just want to say this is New England Authors. If you're just joining us, and our guest is Gabriel Valjan, and he's written. We're actually talking a lot about Italy, but he's written this series that takes place both here in New England and in Italy. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
So. Basically, I wanted her to come to the United States, so I have her in Boston.
Yeah.
The person she's studying is trying to do something with wasps. She doesn't know exactly what that is. At this point in the series, she has somebody on the inside of Rendition who's feeding her information, and she's suspicious of it, but because she always can't turn a challenge away, she takes it with a slight suspicion, but she still runs with it. In the third book, I bring the team over to Milan, and this was, I would say, probably the most challenging of the series for me to write, because it took me to an area of history that I did not know that much about.
Yes.
And that was the years of lead.
Yes.
And for viewers, this was a time period I don't think that a lot of Americans know about. It basically started in 1969, went to 1984, and it was basically daily systematic terrorism.
Yeah.
Every day on the news, somebody was either kidnapped, murdered, or bomb went off, and that had a very corrosive psychological effect on people, on Italians, and still to this day, it's a taboo subject to talk about. And
it's unclear who did these things. Okay, initially it was the Red Brigade,
Right.
But then the people infiltrated this organization.
That's right.
And we know for sure, for example, there was a bomb that went off in Milan that came from a stash that the CIA ran. Right. So it's a very murky subject.
It's murky, and I would say the solid theory was you have to step back and you look at post-war Europe, and you realize that Italy was one of the few countries out of Western Europe that had a viable communist party.
Yeah.
They just looked at it as, okay, that person is a communist. I don't think they looked at it as bad, black or gray. They just looked at it as, the way we would look today at the Green Party.
Yeah.
Yes, the majority of people know Democrats and Republicans, but the Green Party is, they have a platform. Whether they're popular or not is another story. But in post-war Europe, I think there was a lot of, the United States being one of them, and a lot of other Western European countries that were frightened by the idea that the prime minister could be communist. And you mentioned the Red Brigade. everything kind of came to a culmination when they kidnapped Aldo Moro.
Aldo Moro, who was a prime minister, and
Right.
and he wanted to form a coalition with the Communist Party.
And
yes.
that set a lot of people on edge. So he was kidnapped. A lot of people at that time, you know, had thought, okay, they kidnapped him, we'll negotiate a release, we'll pay them whatever, and, you know, that would be the end of it. But in reality, he ended up being murdered.
Yes.
And there's very famous footage of him, you know, having these, you know, kind of like in a bunker, being televised, talking about his captors. But in essence, he ended up being assassinated, and that, you know, was the turning point, and the coalition fell apart.
Yeah.
So a lot.
Yeah. I just want to say that the Communist Party there were poised to maybe get the majority of votes.
Correct.
Or be able were to make a coalition government.
That's correct.
Which really freaked out the United States.
And with Milan, you know, the significance with Milan is that it is considered, I mean, obviously when most people think of Italy, they think of Rome as being, you know, the heart of the city, or the heart of the country. But Milan is the financial capital.
The industrial part of,
So for the terrorist attacks to occur there was very symbolic.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've met people in Italy, you know, that have told me that living during that era, emotionally, it was like 9/11 every day.
Yeah.
The newscast every day at the end would run the names of all the people that were either missing or confirmed dead. And just seeing that every day must
There was a big bomb attack on the railway station in Bologna as well. That was
right.
a very devastating attack. Yeah. So you cover this in your book. In fact, you talk about two car bombs that went off. This was much later. Two car bombs that went off in the 1990s against judges who wanted to...
Yes, I actually was in Italy when that happened. And
so was I.
It was so Giovanni Falcone, and Paolo Borsellino. So I think in the movie El Divo, they allude to the Falcone assassination, and with him, they literally blew up part of the highway to get to him.
Yeah.
They you know, his wife was also a magistrate. There was I think 5 bodyguards.
Yes.
2 of them were women.
A massive car bomb.
Yes, I mean it lifted up the highway. It was heard all the way in Palermo.
Yeah.
He was on the way to the airport. With Paolo Borsellino, the situation was a little bit less dramatic. He was actually visiting his mother, and they had parked the car. He had his entourage with him, and he was coming up the steps to his mother's apartment, and the bomb went off.
Yeah.
But the bomb was on the street level, and it took him and, you know, some of his guards.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, as I mentioned in Threading, is the whole idea of resurrecting this terrorism, playing on this idea of, you know, can this be happening again?
Yeah.
The other plot with Bianca is she's investigating a U.S. military prototype for a special type of tank that is very different and is questionable in terms of whether it would be a war crime to actually have it. But, you know, she's surrounded by these men who, you know, either experienced it as a child or experienced it as an adult. So that's the third book, Threading the Needle.
Yeah. So this is Gabriel Valjan. You're combining history and your imagination.
My history and my imagination, and I think a lot of authors do that. They do like a what if, and they play around with ideas. Second series also deals with history, but it's not as cultural. It's set in America. Although the first book starts in Vienna, because that's where the CIA first started. And I deal with, you know, bits and pieces of actual history in those 2 books.
Yeah, the CIA did start in Vienna.
It started as the Office of Strategic Services.
Right.
And essentially it was intended to gather intelligence in a foreign setting. The Americans were, I mean, we do have a history of spies that go back to the Revolutionary War, but with World War II, it was very unique because we were really out of our element. We accept today what we know about the Holocaust because of a lot of testimony from people that have survived or through their children. Americans did not know about the Holocaust proper. They didn't see films of the concentration camps till much later because they were so scandalous and so upsetting that they were afraid how Americans would react to it. If you look in the 40s and 50s, usually when you went to a movie theater, they would do a newsreel before the actual movie, and that's when they did a lot of stuff for the war effort. They didn't want to show that. I remember reading an account, I think it was one of Patton's men, Patton's, Patton and a couple of the other generals, but I'm fairly certain it was Patton, but when he saw what the prisoners were like, he actually threw up. He couldn't handle it.
Yeah. But just going back a little bit, the Russians liberated a lot of Nazi Germany and Poland, and they feel that they actually won the war. The United States feels that we won, but they feel that they were the ones who defeated Nazism, and they suffered great casualties. I think it was 20 million people savagely killed by the Nazis. Yeah.
It's a controversial thing because I have talked to people my age and older, and they're patriotic, but they also think, like the U.S. can't do any wrong. The U.S. Won the war. If we didn't go to the war, they would have lost. Americans also, I think, we fail to realize that our greatest casualty from any conflict was, in total sum of loss of life, was the Civil War.
Oh, yes, that's right. That's right.
So we were, horrible to say this, but we were better at killing each other than we were with foreign enemies.
Yeah, it's a terrible thing to say. Okay, so I know we've covered it. It's a very fascinating discussion. I love talking about Italy and now about Russia. But you did a story. It was called Saving Grace.
Yes.
It was a short story in a collection, and it took place among the Pequot tribes in the 1800s.
Yes.
I just loved the way your voice that you used back there, and it featured a reverend who wanted to attack the Indians, and we learned later that he wanted to do so to cover a personal crime. What got you inspired in that? It's very different than the other books that you've written.
Well, the story Saving Grace, I did for one of the Level Best anthologies, which is at Crime Bake. But when I was starting to write the story, I wanted to not imitate, but sort of emulate the voice of Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Yes.
Which I felt, when you really look at his stories, I mean, I know a lot of us read them in high school because they were anthologized, but they're really, really dark. I mean, he's dealing with some really dark themes.
Yeah.
If you notice in his story, the woods or the wilderness is always the bad place. That's where bad things happen.
Yeah.
So some of the Indians that converted to Christianity were called praying Indians, and they were considered allies of the colonials, but they were never trusted. Well, they're an Indian at heart. They're still a savage. They might turn on us.
Right.
And we have a character who has his own agenda and motive for wanting to attack the Indians. And I also wanted to show in that story how men treated women. And it's sexist, yes, but there was also a certain deference, and it had to do with Calvinism and religion, the whole idea of predestination, and how people treated each other.
Yeah. Finally, we're coming to the end here.
Sure.
I just want to ask you, you've written so much. What do you want to accomplish as a writer?
Well, I enjoy writing series because one of the things I'm really interested in doing is doing a long character arc where I have people meet characters I create, and then, you know, in a certain book later on, you see them change, or, you know, their relationships change. And it's also important to me that I want to show readers that I can write, for lack of better words, in different genres. I don't really like using the word genre because I know on one hand they establish conventions and expectations, but I've always associated genres as a way of organizing the bookstore.
Yes, yes.
But I want to show people that I can write mystery, you know, elements of crime fiction. I could do a historical piece. You know, I consider the company files more historical fiction, even though there is an element of crime in it. So I would say, as an accomplishment, that I hope to leave a body of work that different readers can find and enjoy. You know, that I'm not.
I think you've done this already. I really enjoyed reading your book. This is New England Authors. We're talking with Gabriel Valjan. Great series, two series. One is about Italy and New England. We're supported by the Curiosity Foundation. If you want to get in touch with us, you can go to the Curiosity Foundation website. Thank you for listening. Remember, watch locally.